hello everyone. My name is Trupti Argatimat and I'm a project officer with the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. And it's a pleasure to be here today to introduce the new ICAT Introductory Guide, as well as the updated renewable energy methodology that we have been working on for the past couple of years. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you find these guides useful and practical in supporting policy development and implementation in your respective countries. To start with a bit of background, which I think we are all very familiar with, climate change introduces an unprecedented challenge that requires rapid and far-reaching transformations across virtually all sectors and parts of society. And we can see the scale of this challenge in the latest emissions gap report, which estimates that global emissions need to fall by 55% in the next 10 years. And in this context, accelerating effective climate action and raising ambition is becoming more and more critical to ensure that emissions are being reduced and keeping us on track towards the Paris Agreement's temperature goal. This is where ICAT's resources can play an important role. ICAT supports countries in assessing the impacts of their policies and actions, and this will help strengthen transparency, effectiveness, and overall climate ambition. ICAT has developed a comprehensive set of methodologies to help countries assess the impacts of their climate policies and actions. And here we have the list of ICAT series of assessment guides, as Henning was just describing, and these show us how they are organized. So the series includes GHG impact assessment guides, which support the assessment of GHG impacts of policies and actions in various sectors, such as agriculture, renewable energy, buildings, transport, forest. And cross-cutting assessment guides provide methodologies for assessing sustainable development, transformational change, or the contributions of non-state and subnational actions. Finally, the process guides support stakeholder engagement and technical review. We also have the overarching introductory guide that has been developed, and this provides an overall framework for understanding and applying the assessment guides. Oh, sorry. Coming to the purpose and applicability of the guides, I think Henning elaborated these points already, so I'll keep this a bit brief. At the core, they provide consistent and transparent methodologies for assessing the impacts of climate policies. They provide clear understanding of expected impacts, costs, effectiveness, and they can also help policymakers design more effective and ambitious climate strategies. Most importantly, the guides can inform at all stages of policy development. So at the planning and design stage in the beginning, or an ex-ante assessment, it can help policymakers compare different options, estimate their expected impacts, and use this information to inform their policy design. During implementation, interim assessments could support to track key indicators, monitor progress, and see if there has to be any changes made to make sure the policy is being effective. Finally, once a policy has ended, an ex-post assessment looks at actual impacts achieved, evaluates the effectiveness of the policy, and captures the lessons learned. So the guides can support evidence-based decision-making throughout the entire policy cycle, and this can be crucial for mobilizing of finance by demonstrating the potential and results of effective policies. Finally, the methodologies can support both domestic and international reporting requirements under UNFCCC as well. And in the rest of the presentation, we'll take a look at some of the key highlights of the introductory guide as well as the renewable energy guide. Starting with the introductory guide, it is mainly organized into two parts. Part 1 provides an overview of the guides. It describes the purpose, the structure, the potential uses of all the guides in the series, and it explains how they relate to and support the objectives of the Paris Agreement, including the updating and implementation of NDCs. Part 2 covers the planning and conducting of assessments. So this part presents the common elements that apply across all GHG impact assessment guides. And this includes assessment quality principles, stakeholder engagement, setting of objectives, methodological considerations, etc. It also provides a guidance on cost estimation, monitoring, reporting, and finalizing of assessments. So throughout this introductory guide, users can find references are being provided to relevant specific guides in the series, allowing them to easily navigate between general and specific content. So, in a nutshell, the intro guide provides the overall framework for understanding and applying the assessment guides. And it also gives users the overview of the full series of the ICAT assessment guides and provides a common foundation that can be used. Specifically, it introduces each policy assessment guide, outlines its scope and the types of policies it covers, and this can help users to identify which guide is the most relevant given their national context. It also explains how the guides are structured and relate to one another, and how they can be combined to support more comprehensive assessments. It also brings together key elements common to GHG impact assessment guides, including the purpose and scope of assessments, intended users, guiding principle, methodological considerations, alignment with ETF, and links to sustainable development goals. So now let's take a closer look at the renewable energy methodology. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the sector-specific GHG impact assessment guides in the series, and it provides policymakers with practical methodological guidance to assess the GHG impacts of renewable energy policies, and also helps them understand the factors that influence the implementation, and ultimately assess how renewable energy deployment could translate into emission reduction. As Mahit was also mentioning earlier, we know that renewable energy has significant potential to reduce emissions by replacing fossil fuel-based energy generation, and it is expected to play a major role in achieving emission reductions in the coming decades. So, against this backdrop, it is important to assess the impact of renewable energy policies in a consistent and transparent way, and to understand whether they are delivering the expected results and contributing to national and global climate objectives. So the methodology supports policymakers in doing exactly this. So it can help them assess and strengthen the effectiveness of renewable energy policies, while also providing information that can support reporting under the enhanced transparency framework. Here we have the list of policies that are covered by the guide. There are, of course, many different renewable energy policies that have been adopted and successfully implemented across the world. However, in this guide, we focus on 5 of the most widely used policies. And for each policy, we have provided examples and practical guidance on how the different steps in the methodology are organized, so the users can better understand how the overall assessment process works. So the 5 policies that are covered are feed-in tariffs, which provide renewable energy producers with a guaranteed price for the electricity that they supply to the grid. Then we have auction and tender policies, which use competitive bidding processes to procure renewable electricity. And usually the most competitive offers wins the bid from project developers. Then we have the tax incentive policies, which provides tax benefits or incentives to support the installation and operation of renewable energy projects. Then the net metering and the VRE policies are the latest addition to this guide. So the net metering policy allows electricity consumers who also generate their own energy to feed excess back into the grid. And for this, they would typically receive a credit. And finally, the variable renewable energy integration policies support technologies and system upgrades, such as battery storage, for example, to help integrate variable renewable sources such as solar and wind into the electricity system. One important point to note is that the policies and methodology that we have presented in the guide applies mainly to electricity that is being fed into the grid. The RA methodology has been organized into 3 main parts. Part 1 begins with planning the assessment, which includes a brief overview of reporting frameworks, stakeholder engagement, policy objectives, and methodological considerations that are relevant to the sector. And it can help users identify policies that are applicable to their context, including an overview of policy types and the scope of the methodology. Then it moves on to part two, which supports users in clearly describing the selected policy, identifying intermediate effects and potential GHG impacts, how to develop a causal chain, defining assessment boundary and period, all of this while taking into account interactions with other policies. And finally, in part three, we have presented the core of the methodology, which includes steps to estimate the addition of renewable energy, GHG impacts for both ex ante and ex post assessments, how to estimate the cost of policy implementation, etc. So basically, this guide can be used at various stages of the policy cycle, and we will take a look at few of the highlights in the following slides. So here we start with defining the policy, the causal chain, and the GHG assessment boundary. And this step basically sets up the foundation for the entire assessment. We begin by clearly defining the policy that is being assessed and identifying the key intermediate effects through which the policy is expected to influence the emissions. These relationships are then mapped through the causal chain, which links policy actions to resulting emission outcomes. The methodology also guides users in defining the appropriate assessment boundary and time frame, including whether the assessment will be ex post, ex ante, or whether you want to estimate the impacts beforehand or to assess actual impacts that have been achieved after the policy has been implemented. Finally, it will look at how the policy interacts with other policies and measures, including synergies and trade-offs. So this is important because these interactions can influence not only GHG outcomes, but also sustainable development objectives and broader transformational change. And in the next few slides, we will take a brief look at these shortly. Yeah. So starting with defining the policy to be assessed. To carry out an effective impact assessment, it is important to first have a clear and detailed understanding of the policy being assessed. And to support this, the methodology provides a checklist of key information that we can see on the slide here. And this includes, for example, the type of policy instrument. This could be auctions or tenders. What are its objectives? Details regarding its implementation, the sectors and GHG gases that are being affected, as well as other relevant policy characteristics. So together, this information helps clearly define the policy and provides a solid foundation for the assessment that will follow. Next, we have to identify the intermediate effects of the policy, which lead to GHG impacts, and use these to develop the causal chain. For most renewable energy interventions, the main impact is either the displacement of emissions from existing fossil fuel plants or the avoidance of emissions from new fossil fuel capacity that would otherwise would have been built. So for these more standard interventions, the guide provides a standardized impact identification framework to make the assessment more efficient while still maintaining a clear audit trail. At the same time, the methodology highlights when it is important to engage relevant stakeholders to identify intermediate effects. This could include, for example, changes in behavior, in technologies, in processes or practices that would ultimately lead to GHG impacts. The final step is to develop the causal chain, which maps the sequence of cause and effect relationships, showing how the policy ultimately leads to GHG impacts. And in the slide here, you can see a generic example of how a causal chain would look like. Next, we need to define the assessment period, which is the period over which the impacts of the policy will be assessed. The appropriate time frame would depend largely on the status of the policy and whether we are conducting an ex ante or an ex post assessment. As I mentioned earlier, if the policy is still being planned but not yet implemented, it will generally be an ex ante assessment, and it will focus on the expected impacts in the future. If the policy is has already been implemented and is ongoing, we can conduct an ex post assessment to understand the impacts achieved to date, or an ex ante assessment to estimate future impacts, or you can do a combination of both, which can be useful for monitoring progress and identifying whether any adjustment or course correction is needed at this point. And finally, you can also have an ex post assessment, which will identify how well the policy performed over its time frame. So, in simple terms, ex post looks at the impacts achieved so far, and ex ante looks at the expected future impacts, and a combined assessment will look at both. The next part focuses on estimating the renewable energy deployment resulting from a policy, primarily using an ex ante approach. The idea here is to start by looking at the technical potential and then gradually consider the different factors that could affect how much of that potential can actually be achieved. The methodology provides a four-step approach for estimating the renewable energy additions, and the four steps essentially take us from the technical potential through to policy design, financial feasibility, and finally to the non-financial barriers that may limit the deployment. However, it is important to note that not everyone needs to apply all four steps. It is very dependent on the purpose of the assessment and how much analysis has already been carried out. For example, if a country is assessing an existing policy against an NDC target that has already been defined, the technical potential may not need to be assessed separately, as this analysis may have already been reflected in the target setting process. So, similarly, if a country has already carried out a comprehensive analysis of policy design, financial feasibility, and barriers when developing the NDCs, some of these other steps could also be skipped. However, it is very rare to find such comprehensive analysis already prepared. So, in such cases, the methodology recommends focusing on the remaining barriers that could affect renewable energy. And steps 2 to 4 can be also considered together. This approach is also useful for course correction during policy implementation. If an ex post assessment shows that a policy is not achieving its intended objectives, these steps can be revisited to identify whether changes are needed in the policy design, financial conditions, or measures to address remaining barriers. Finally, for a new policy that is still being designed, the recommendation would generally be to apply all four steps to develop a more robust estimate of the renewable energy deployment that the policy could potentially achieve. The methodology here essentially helps users move from what could theoretically be deployed to what renewable energy deployment can we reasonably expect this policy to achieve. Next, we have the estimation of GHG impacts of the policy as part of the ex ante assessment. So the purpose here is to take the renewable energy additions we estimated in the previous section and translate them into expected GHG emission reductions over the assessment period. There are two main approaches here which can be used, which is the emissions trajectory method and the grid emission factor method. The choice between them will depend on various factors such as the characteristics of the power system, level of renewable energy penetration, availability of data, capacity of the personnel, etc. So before choosing an approach, we first need to define two scenarios. The baseline scenario, which will represent what is expected to happen without the policy in place, and the policy scenario, which represents what is expected to happen with the policy in place. And the difference between emissions between these two scenarios gives us the GHG impact, which we can attribute to the policy. Once these scenarios are established, we can select the most appropriate method for estimating the GHG impacts. The trajectory method, for example, looks at how emissions are expected to evolve over time based on the projected electricity generation mix. It incorporates the renewable energy additions estimated earlier and considers how these additions affect the overall power system. In the second approach, which is the grid emission factor method, this simple approach assumes that renewable energy that is being generated displaces the electricity from other sources on the grid. So the GHG reduction is then estimated using an emission factor that represents the electricity generation that is being displaced. So in simple terms, the emission trajectory method looks at how the electricity system and its emissions are expected to evolve, while the grid emission factor method focuses on the emissions associated with the electricity that is displaced by renewable energy. So throughout this step of the methodology, the guide provides practical support for carrying out the entire assessment. This includes guidance on what data would be required, how to find it, where to find benchmarks, how to select the appropriate modeling tools, and how to deal with different methodological choices, which will be very important once the assessment gets ongoing. Finally, we have the overview of estimating GHG impacts of a policy if you're using an ex post approach. So unlike in the ex ante assessment, which is based on projected energy deployment, an ex post assessment looks at what actually happened. So it uses observed data during or after policy implementation to estimate the renewable energy additions achieved and the resulting GHG impacts. So there are three main objectives for this type of assessment. The first is to compare the results achieved with the policy targets. For example, we can compare the actual GHG emissions with relevant sectoral targets if they exist. The second would be to compare the actual results with the baseline scenario. And in this case, we want to understand what would have happened in the absence of policy. So we can develop a baseline that assumes the same amount of electricity that would have been generated, but using a non-renewable or business as usual scenario. Other conditions such as economic trends have to be kept consistent in this case. And then we can then compare the policy scenario with the baseline to estimate the GHG impacts that can be attributed to the policy. And the final objective is to compare actual results with what was projected in the ex ante assessment. So this will allow us to see how the policy has been performing, whether or not it was performing as expected. So if the achieved renewable energy additions are higher than the projections in the ex ante assessment, this could indicate that the policy was performing well. And it could also be potentially because of some complementary or supporting policies. On the other hand, if the deployment has been slow or lower than expected, it could indicate that the policy has been less effective than anticipated, or that other factors or policies have limited its impact. So this comparison is particularly useful because it allows us to learn from what actually happened. It can also help identify policy interactions and overlaps, avoid double counting of emissions, and also improve the assumptions used in future ex ante assessments. So overall, the ex post assessment is not just about measuring results. It also provides an important opportunity to learn from implementation and improve future policy design as well, which is very critical. So I think that was it for my presentation, and I'll stop here. But I hope this has given you a quick overview of each of the guides and key elements that they cover. And before we close, I would like to take a moment to thank everyone who has contributed to the development of these guides and helped shape it along the way. Special thank you to Ivana and Jyoti, our lead authors, for their tremendous work for developing this guide. And of course, a big thank you to our colleagues in ICAT for their reviews, for their expertise and their feedback. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and strengthening the guide. So thank you, everybody, for being part of the process. And over to you, Hannah.